I'd like to first open it up if there are any questions, first from the audience on any of the topics. Stand, because actually they're bringing a microphone to you.
I'm just curious about how you feel about using toric lenses in patients with keratoconus.
Okay, toric lenses in, I didn't hear the second.
Keratoconus patients.
I'll give my opinion, and then we'll move on.
Go ahead.
Toric lenses in, basically, it really depends on the degree of the keratoconus. If this is a stable cone that you don't anticipate future treatment for, and if when you refract the patient, the toric correction adds their visual acuity, and they are not dependent on a rigid lens for best correcting, I'm not going to use a rigid lens, that would be fine. If you put a toric in, however, in a patient that requires a rigid lens, then you've actually made a somewhat simple problem very complicated, because if you put a rigid lens on an eye with a toric lens, you effectively expose the toricity of the IOL in an opposite axis. And then if you try to correct it with a toric lens and the lens moves, you have lots of aberration. So basically, I always tell residents, something we don't do anymore, which we should be doing more, is a rigid diagnostic lens fit. If your keratoconic patient has reasonable vision without a rigid lens, I'm fine with torics. I think they're excellent. But if you're really going to end up having to put a rigid lens on the patient, you should avoid a toric lens, because it actually makes it harder to fit the patient. And they have more aberration if you fit a toric rigid lens or just a rigid lens on a patient that has a toric IOL. Could you?
Rigid lens is for you the contact lens, or no?
Now, if the patient requires a rigid lens for useful vision,
yes,
then I do not put a toric lens in, because the rigid lens will correct it. And if you put a rigid lens over a cornea that has a toric IOL, you just expose the toricity of the IOL. And the only way to compensate it then is a toric lens or a back toric, which are hard to fit. So a real simple answer, if they require a rigid lens for functional vision, I don't put a toric. If they have reasonable vision, so basically you're talking about early keratoconus, and they can get by with spectacles, then a toric IOL is excellent.
I like that thought, but on top of all this, when you have a keratoconus patient, and as Michael just pointed out, if it's not a stable cone and the cornea moves, one day, even with cross-linking, we have to do penetrating keratoplasty, maybe, we don't know. And what you have then is, you have a toric lens in the eye with this astigmatism, you put a cornea on this, and it totally changes. So the concept in these eyes can be, because number one, it's irregular corneal astigmatism, most of the time, irregular, and the toric lens basically corrects usually for a regular cornea, a regular astigmatism. One concept actually could be to put a normal lens or a non-toric lens in the posterior and in the capsular bag, and the toric lens on top of this, as we very often do now, add on technology, because when you have then to do a penetrating keratoplasty later, you can exchange this easily. You can't do this if you have it in the capsular bag. So I think it's a very difficult topic, and again, I think the most important thing is that stability of the corneal component is, and if you have no useful vision without glasses, then it's a problem, and you have to use rigid contact lenses in order to improve. So I agree with Michael.
I have one more question.
Oh, no, yeah, I was going to say, I just second all that, and often with those cases we do cross-linking first to stabilize the cornea, and then if they're spectacle corrected and happy with their spectacle correction, then we're comfortable with the toric lens. But if they're not spectacle corrected and they need a contact lens, then we don't do the toric. And usually on those cases, I put a capsule tension ring in with the thought that there's a higher chance of having to pull that lens out, and it gives a little bit more stability, or a higher chance that you might have to rotate that lens with inside the eye. So the capsule tension ring gives a little bit more stability if you needed to do something in the future.
Let me point to that question something out. Therefore, I think it's so important to have that device, because if we now moving from cataract to refractive cataract surgery, which we're basically doing, we're correcting astigmatism, we're correcting presbyopia, we all do this. We need the information on the cornea. It's not enough just to have an IOL master or a keratometer and say it has an astigmatism or one diopter. It's not enough. You need to look at the cornea. You need to understand what's going on, and if you have a suspicion for form fruste keratoconus, we know the incidence is 1 out of 2,000 people, maybe, and it can be 1 out of 3,000, whatever. But we need to understand the cornea, and therefore the screening tool Oculus provided here is for me very important. Every patient I do premium IOL, I take a scan. I take the corneal display, I look at the cataract display, I get this information. If I don't have that,
You had another question, you
I
said.
have one more, and that is, is this eliminating your use of the aura, or if it is not, and you have a conflict between the two, what's your default on that, between the aura and your preoperative implant power calculation?
So I still use aura, and what's interesting with aura, aura is very much dependent on preoperative Ks as well. So that you plug the preoperative keratometry into aura, and if those Ks aren't quite correct, then the aura measurement's not going to be quite correct. So what's nice is it kind of makes aura a little bit more accurate and powerful because you have better information going in on the front end. Also, it helps sort of give you confidence that you sort of reassures you when you see something weird on aura compared to IOL master, you're not sure which one's true. Now this is sort of two measurements trying to do the same thing. I suppose there are some times when those two things will differ, and then you have to make the clinical judgment, which one do you trust, and was there something maybe preoperative that wasn't quite right that made that scan inaccurate, or is there something in the operating room, a variable that's temporary that makes aura not accurate? So you kind of have to make that clinical judgment. So I think it's additive to aura. So far it hasn't been replacing it for me, but it's sort of a good synergy.
Any other questions from the audience? Any questions from the panel?
Yes, Tom, so I was curious with the study that showed the consistency with axial length with IOL master versus Pentacam. I had seen anecdotally that some of the Ks were different, which is what you would expect. But on a large scale study, when there were differences in corneal power, did they do a retrospective analysis of seeing which one was more accurate? Let's say the IOL master or Pentacam, or has that data been looked at?
it's difficult to say because it's like you take your measurement. 1 meter is 1 meter, right?
Right.
So what's the right? Who makes the decision of what is 1 meter? So what we basically in this study did, we did it retrospectively, and then we said, no, okay, we can't do this. We found the same outcome basically, but then we said, okay, let's do prospectively, taking 2 measurements with all 3 devices, change it, and then we come out to the basically very similar. The measurements overall was 23.01, and the other one was 23.02 something. So very close measurements in all 3 devices. There was a slight difference in the opacification. I mean, 500. You sometimes don't get the IOL Master 500. You cannot screen every cataract, but I think with the AXL and the 700, it's very close. So I mean, it's an improvement again. And the advantage here is now you have in your device, as you also pointed out, you have the axial length, and you can, and Oculus have done that perfectly. You add the corneal total refractive power and put it all together. So this is really the measurement where you have that measurement of the total power, combine it with axial length, and then come up with your toricity.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm going to make a comment. I know you alluded to it. I made a comment on it. The original Alcon formula, which I think most people now are not using any longer, but the original one just assumed that the posterior surface was a constant. It just assigned it an arbitrary number. People are under the misconception that the Barrett formula somehow measures the posterior surface. What they did with the Barrett is they didn't assume a constant relationship. In with the rule patients, there's about a 95% alignment of the posterior surface to the anterior surface. And against the rule, it's about 2/3, if I remember the numbers correctly. And oblique is completely random. So they adjusted based on that. So it does a better job than just assuming a constant relationship, but it's still not measuring the posterior surface. The AXL, Pentacam AXL, uses tomographic data and does measure the posterior surface. So we're having Formula 1 that just assumed a constant relationship like a keratometer, Formula 2 that looked like a population distribution, said, okay, we can do better, though we're not measuring it, and then the Pentacam AXL, which actually does measure it, and that's a very big difference. So if there are no other questions, go ahead.
Can you repeat the question?
That I heard was, why is the Pentacam better than the competitor? Talking about the Pentacam or the Pentacam AXL? To my knowledge, it's the only device currently that incorporates both tomography and axial lens measurement.
The real answer is I cannot say you this. I cannot give you an answer to that question. We have to evaluate this, in my opinion, because I need a big data to take a look. But as Michael pointed out, as we all pointed out, it's the only device, to my knowledge, who has in one device taking into the consideration the total corneal power. Remember, Graham-Barrett's formula is an estimation of the posterior corneal. And of course, he has a big database, and then you say against the rule, with the rule, and you estimate the cornea. And it's better than the previous measurement devices, but I think finally, we have really to measure it and put it into the formula. That's the ultimate goal.
I'll answer your question. I get asked a lot, not related to the AXL, but just why is the Pentacam better than the other Scheimpflug devices? And the quick answer I give everyone is software. The amount of software development on the Pentacam is just heads above any other device that's currently available. And I think you saw software that I don't have an AXL, and I was even surprised at some of the newer software developments. So I want to thank you all. We have one more question. Sorry.
I think you started to answer it right there. I had a question about the linking of corneal devices to femtosecond lasers for the treatment of astigmatism. Is there an opinion on the panel of a best device, Cassini, the Pentacam, or the OPD3? Anybody have an opinion on that?
Yes. So I've got all three of those devices. They're all great. I think actually each one can link well to the femtosecond laser and do a good job. Then it boils down to more or less which device do you find more useful as a clinical tool. And I found that in general, Pentacam is the only one that measures anterior and posterior. Cassini does do it, but a little bit differently. It's not really measuring thickness and shape. It's doing a reflection of the posterior cornea, so it's a little bit different. But I found that the Pentacam I find is the most useful tool clinically, so it's my go-to. But the other two devices, are better than not to link to a laser. I think it's nice to have that, rotational sort of linkage, to make sure that when you're treating something, you're treating it on the correct axis. So I think all three are very good, but I'm leaning towards the Pentacam, mostly just because of I find it's a more clinically useful tool for refractive surgery. Yeah.
Thank you all.